I'm Sloan Whitaker, 45, and I spent 23 years flying fighter jets while the world kept deciding I couldn't. For years, I answered every doubt the only way I knew how, by flying better than the men who doubted me and saying nothing at all. But when a young airman laughed in my face at the hangar the morning before I took command, I had to make a choice about the kind of leader I was going to be. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you really were? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe. The morning I came back to take command, I got to the base 2 hours before sunrise and sat in my truck outside the gate with the engine off. I did not need to be there that early. The change of command was still 2 days away, and there were aides and schedules and a whole machine ready to walk me through every minute of it. But I have never been able to meet a place for the first time with a crowd around me. I wanted to walk the flight line alone, in the dark, before anyone could tell me what to look at. So I left my uniform hanging in the closet at the lodging, and I put on the old leather flight jacket I have had since I was 24. No rank on it, no name, just cracked leather and a zipper that sticks. My father gave a version of that jacket to me the year I earned my wings, and I have worn one like it ever since. When I want to remember who I am underneath the eagle on my shoulder, I put it on. I should tell you about my father, because everything starts with him. He flew crop dusters out of a dirt strip in a farm town most people have never heard of. He could thread an airplane between a power line and a tree line at sunrise with a hangover and a cigarette, and he loved flying more than almost anything in his life. He taught me to fly in an old Piper before I could legally drive. I soloed at 16. I still remember the look on his face when I taxied back in, this strange mix of pride and worry, like he had handed me something he wished he could take back. Because here's the thing about my father. He gave me the sky, and then he spent years telling me not to want it. The summer I turned 18, the summer I told him I had been accepted to the Air Force Academy, he stood in the kitchen with his coffee and looked out at the strip and said, "Flying's a hard living, Sloan. Harder for a girl. Don't break your heart on it." He did not say it to be cruel. He said it because he was scared, and that is a complicated kind of love. I did not argue with him. I have never been much for arguing. I just decided I would fly so well that the argument would settle itself. I went to the academy in the fall of 1999. For long stretches, I was the only woman in my flight, and I learned early what it feels like to walk into a room and watch everyone quietly decide what you are before you have said a word. I did not fight it. I answered it. When the hard question came in the briefing and the instructor skipped past me to the men, I waited, and then I gave the answer, and I let the answer do the talking. I earned my wings in 2005, flying the F-16, the jet the pilots all call the Viper, and I earned my call sign the same year in an ice storm when an engine started to die on me on final approach and the whole world wanted me to panic. I did not panic. I talked myself down the glide slope in a voice so level that the tower asked afterward if I had even noticed the emergency. One of the old majors heard the tape and said, "She's got ice in her veins. Frosty." It stuck. People think call signs are handed to you like nicknames. They are not. You earn them, usually on your worst day, and then you carry them. There was one person on that flight line in 2005 who never once looked at me and saw a girl who was lost. Her name is Yolanda Reese. She was a young crew chief then, the kind who could find a fuel leak by smell, and she signed off my first jet. The day I climbed down from my first solo in the Viper, she looked at me, wiped her hands on a rag, and said, "You fly it like you own it, Lieutenant. Don't let anybody tell you different." 21 years later, she is a Chief Master Sergeant, the senior enlisted leader of the very group I was about to command. And she is still the truest friend I have. Rank never touched that friendship. It was built on competence, and competence does not care what you are wearing. I sat in that truck and I thought about all of it, the dirt strip and the kitchen and the ice storm and Yolanda's rag, while the runway lights came up gold against the dark. 23 years of flying, 2 combat tours, more than 3,200 hours in a single-seat fighter. A wall of paper at home that says, in the formal language of the service, that I am very good at the most demanding thing I know how to do. And underneath all of it, the 18-year-old in the kitchen, listening to the one man she loved most tell her not to want the only thing she had ever wanted. I learned a long time ago that the people who matter never ask you to prove it. So I stopped explaining myself. I just kept flying. That was the whole philosophy I carried up to that gate. Let the work answer. Let the truth land on its own. People ask me sometimes why I still walk a flight line before dawn when I could send a junior officer to do it. The answer is that a flight line tells you the truth about a unit, and it only tells you the truth when no one is performing for you. You can read a squadron in the dark. You can tell whether the tools are squared away because somebody cares or because somebody is afraid. You can tell whether the jets are loved. A hangar at 5 a.m. does not lie, and I have spent my whole life trusting things that do not lie over people who do. My father taught me that, in his way, walking his own strip every morning before the heat came up, checking the wires on his old Piper with his bare hands, talking to the airplane like it could hear him. I used to think it was superstition. I understand now it was respect. He was the most careful man I ever knew about the things that could kill him, and the least careful man I ever knew about the things he said to the people he loved. I have tried my whole life to be careful about both. That morning, in the cold, with the runway lights coming up gold, I was just my father's daughter again, walking the line before anyone could tell me what to see. I pressed my badge to the reader, and the gate arm lifted. The base was quiet, the way only a flight line is quiet before dawn. That held breath stillness right before the first jets wake up. I drove past the dark squadron buildings and parked near the hangars, and I sat for one more minute with my hands on the wheel. I had come home to a place I had to earn twice. Once as a young lieutenant nobody expected, and now as a colonel about to take a guide in and become responsible for every pilot and every wrench turner on that line. I did not know yet that before the sun was fully up, a 22-year-old with grease on his hands was going to look me in the eye and decide, in the space of a breath, that a woman could not possibly be what she said she was. And I did not know that I was about to be handed the exact lesson I had spent my whole life learning, one more time on the morning I least expected it. I zipped the old jacket against the cold and walked toward the hangar. If you want to understand why the hangar did not break me, you have to understand that I had walked into that exact moment 100 times before. Not the same hangar, not the same boy, but the same moment, the one where the room looks at you and gets you wrong, and you have to decide in half a second who you are going to be about it. The first time it really landed was in 2008 on my first combat deployment. I was a captain by then, 27 years old, with a tour ahead of me that would test everything I had. A senior officer visiting the squadron walked up to me in the hallway, held out his garment bag, and said, "Be a dear and get this to my room, would you?" He thought I was support staff. I was the pilot who would be flying his protection package the next morning. I did not correct him. I took the bag, hung it in the visiting quarters, and at the brief, the next day I watched the exact moment he realized the woman he had handed his laundry to was the one keeping his aircraft safe. He never apologized. He did not need to. The flying said everything I would have said, and more. That was the pattern of my whole career, and I want to be honest about it because it was rarely cruelty. It was assumption. A briefer would address, "Gentlemen," and skip my eyes until the hard question came up and I was the one with the answer. A visiting general would scan a flight of pilots and his gaze would slide right past me to find the man in charge, and the man in charge would point at me. A contractor at the gate would ask to speak to one of the pilots while looking straight through me. After a while, you stop correcting people in the moment. You just wait for the part where the truth does it for you. It is less satisfying than people imagine, and it is also the only thing that ever actually worked. I built a whole life on that quiet arithmetic, and I will not pretend it never wore on me. There were nights, early in my career, when I would land after a flight I knew had been clean and sharp and better than anything the men around me had flown, and I would sit in the debrief and watch the credit drift somewhere else. And I would drive home and wonder how many times a person can be undeniable before anyone bothers to deny it less. I never said any of that out loud. I came up in a time and a place where saying it would have been read as proof that I could not handle the work. So I swallowed it, and I flew. And slowly, year by year, the record got too long to argue with. That is the part nobody tells young women who want to do hard things. The truth does win, eventually, but eventually can take a decade, and you have to be willing to be right and unrecognized for a long time before the recognition catches up. I was willing. I do not know exactly where the willingness came from. Maybe from a man in a kitchen who doubted me just enough to make me stubborn for the rest of my life. The tour in 2011 is the one that matters for this story, because it is the reason there was a particular jet sitting in that hangar. I will not dress it up. There was a ground unit pinned down a long way from help, and the weather was bad, and I was the closest fast air with the fuel and the eyes to do anything about it. I flew a jet we called 42 after the last two numbers stenciled under the canopy rail, and I flew it low and slow and careful in conditions that should have sent us home, and I kept my voice level on the radio the whole time because the kids on the ground could hear me and they needed to believe somebody up there was calm. We brought all of them home, everyone. The Air Force gave me a second Distinguished Flying Cross for it, and years later, when 42 was finally retired from active flying, the wing kept it as a heritage aircraft, polished and parked, a piece of its own history. I did not know, driving in that morning, that 42 was the very jet I was about to find in that hangar. The service has a sense of humor like that. After the combat tours came the slow climb that nobody makes videos about. Major in 2013, teaching at the weapons school. Learning that the best pilots are usually the best teachers because they can explain the thing their hands already know. Lieutenant Colonel in 2016. Command of a fighter squadron in 2019, which is where I learned the lesson that made me the commander I am. Command is not about the flying. The flying is the easy part. Command is about the people who are out on a freezing flight line at 4 a.m, turning wrenches with bare fingers so that the jet I strap into at dawn will not kill me. I never once forgot that, and I made a private promise that I would never become the kind of officer who looked at a crew chief and saw furniture. I made colonel in 2024, and this spring, at 45, I was selected to be the operations group commander of this wing, which means that on the radio net, and on the flight line, and in the mouths of every airman on that base, I am about to become Frosty 6. The number 6 is the part civilians miss. In our world, the 6 is the commander. Frosty was the pilot. Frosty 6 is the boss. They are the same person, but the 6 means every soul in that group answers to her. 2 nights before I drove through that gate, I had Yolanda Reese on the phone. We had not served together in years, but we talked the way old friends talk, with no warm-up. She was telling me about the group I was inheriting. "They're good kids, Colonel," she said. "Sharp, best maintainers I've had in a while. Couple of them think they invented the airplane." She laughed. "They'll learn." "They always do," I said. "You coming in for the dog and pony, or you coming in your way?" She knew me. "My way," I said. "Early, quiet. I want to see the line before the line sees me." There was a pause, and I could hear her smiling. "Wear the jacket," she said. "Don't give them the eagle on day 1. Make them earn the look on their own faces." I did not know how right she was. I hung up, and I looked at the old leather jacket folded on the passenger seat, and I made my decision. No uniform, no rank, just the leather and the truth, and whatever the morning decided to do with both. The hangar doors were open when I reached them, the big main bay lit up against the last of the dark, and there in the center of it, washed and gleaming and parked like a museum piece, sat a jet with the numbers 4 and 2 stenciled under the canopy rail. 42, my jet. I stopped at the edge of the light and felt something go tight in my chest because I had not expected to be ambushed by my own history before breakfast. I started across the hangar floor toward it, and that is when the young man stepped into my path. He was 22, maybe 23, with grease on his hands and a crew chief's confidence in his shoulders, the kind of confidence a young man wears before life has had a chance to sand it down. His name tape, I would learn, said Pruitt. He put himself between me and the jet with a polite little half smile, the smile you give someone you have already decided is a problem to be managed. "Ma'am," he said, "visitors stay behind the line. This is a restricted area." He gestured at the painted line on the floor without really looking at me, already certain of what I was. A wife who had wandered off a tour, a contractor's spouse who had taken a wrong turn looking for the visitor center. "I came to see the jet," I said. "I'm sure you did, ma'am, but this whole bay is off limits unless you're aircrew or maintenance." He said aircrew the way you would say a word a child could not possibly understand. "I'm a pilot," I said. Even, quiet, just the fact. And he laughed. He actually laughed, glanced back over his shoulder at 2 other young airmen by the toolboxes, the way a kid checks to see if his friends caught the joke, and he said it. "Ladies get call signs now." The two by the toolboxes snickered. One of them ducked his head. Pruitt turned back to me with the grin still on his face, pleased with himself, waiting for me to be embarrassed and leave. I have been asked since then whether I was angry in that moment, and the honest answer is that anger was not the first thing, or even the 10th thing I felt. What I felt mostly was a kind of weary recognition, the way you feel when a song you have heard 1,000 times comes on the radio again. I knew this scene. I had stood in it on 3 continents and in 2 wars, and in more hallways and hangars and briefing rooms than I could count. A young man, sure of the shape of the world, looking at me and finding me in the wrong shape. The specifics changed. The morning never did. And the strange gift of having lived inside that moment so many times is that it had lost almost all of its power to hurt me. It could still tire me. It could still make me sad for the next woman who would have to stand in it. But it could not make me flinch. And a man who is waiting for you to flinch does not know what to do when you simply look at him and wait. I want to tell you exactly what went through me in that moment, because it was not anger. I had waited 23 years for the truth to walk into a room on its own. I could wait another 30 seconds. I did not reach for my identification. I did not pull rank. I did not raise my voice or straighten my spine or do any of the things a smaller version of me might have done at 25. I just looked at him, this boy who had decided in the space of one breath that the thing I had given my entire adult life to was a punchline, and I felt something almost like tenderness because I had met him 100 times, and he had never once known who I was until it was too late. "What's your name, Airman?" I asked, still even. Something in my voice made the grin flicker, just slightly. "Pruitt, ma'am." A beat. "Senior Airman Pruitt." I nodded. I was about to answer him in my own time when a voice cut across the whole hangar like a blade. "Attention on the line." It was Yolanda Reese. She had come in through the back of the bay, and she had stopped dead the instant she saw my face, and then everything about her changed. Her shoulders, her chin, her whole bearing snapped into something formal and absolute. And then she said the words that ended Mason Pruitt's morning. "Frosty 6 is on deck." I have heard a lot of silences in my life. The silence after an engine quits. The silence on a radio when you do not yet know if the people on the ground are alive. None of them landed quite the way that one did. Boots scraped on concrete. The 2 airmen by the toolboxes came upright so fast one of them knocked a wrench off the bench, and it rang on the floor and nobody moved to get it. And Mason Pruitt's grin fell off his face like something physical, like it had weight, like it hit the ground next to the wrench. I watched him try to make it make sense. I watched his eyes go from me to Reese, to the jet behind me, to the name. Because under the canopy rail of 42, beneath those 2 stenciled numbers, the wing had painted the name of the pilot who flew it in combat. My name. He read it. I watched him read it. I watched him understand that the woman he had just asked whether ladies get call signs was the call sign, was the 6, was the colonel who in 2 days would hold the guidon for every single person in that building, including him. His mouth opened, nothing came out, and then it got worse for him in the way these things do because Brigadier General Curtis Hale, the wing commander, chose that exact moment to walk in for the same early walk-around I had come for. He saw me across the hangar, and his whole face opened up into a grin, and he came toward me with his hand out, warm as anything. "Frosty," he said. "Good to have you home. The group's lucky to get you." He shook my hand, clapped my shoulder, glanced at the jet. "They give you a proper hello yet?" Pruitt looked like he wanted the concrete to open and take him. "We were just getting acquainted, sir," I said. I did not pounce. I want you to understand that, because I think the version of the story where I crushed him would have felt good for about 4 seconds, and then would have made me into something I have spent my whole life refusing to become. What I did instead was walk the jet. I stepped around General Hale and put my hand on the flank of 42, that cool metal skin I had not touched in years, and I let the general and the chief fall in beside me, and I talked them around the airframe the way you would walk a friend around an old house. Pruitt and his 2 friends stood frozen at the edge of the light, and I let them stand there. And I told Hale a clean version of the 2011 mission. Just the bones of it, the weather and the ground unit, and the long, careful work of bringing everyone home. I did not look at Pruitt while I told it. But I knew he was listening to every word, and I knew he was doing the arithmetic, matching the story to the name under the canopy rail to the woman he had laughed at. When Hale stepped away to take a call, Reese came up beside me with her arms crossed and her jaw set. She was quiet for a second, watching Pruitt out of the corner of her eye. "Say the word," she said, low. "And that Airman is on every detail I can find between now and his retirement. I will have him counting tools until his grandchildren are bored of the story." I almost smiled. "He's 22, Chief. He's 22 and he ran his mouth at a colonel." "I've been 22 and sure of the wrong thing," I said. "So have you." She did not argue with that. "Let me think about it." She gave me a long look, the kind only a friend of 21 years can give you, and then she nodded and let it go. "Your call, Frosty," she said. "It always was." The truth is, the vindication did not feel the way people think it feels. It felt colder than that. Because standing there with my hand on my own jet, with a general greeting me by my call sign and a chief calling the room to attention, I was watching a 22-year-old finally believe that a woman had flown that fighter. And the thing that ached was not his rudeness. It was that it had taken all of that, the tail number and the general and the chief's voice cracking across the bay, to make him believe it. My word had not been enough. It is never enough. It was not enough in the kitchen when I was 18, and it was not enough in the hangar at 45. And somewhere in between those two mornings is the whole reason I do this work. I have made a kind of peace with that, but peace is not the same as not minding. I do mind. I mind that a young woman's competence is a thing she has to keep proving, while a young man's is a thing he gets to assume. I mind that the proof, when it finally comes, so often has to arrive in the form of a general's handshake or a tail number with a name on it, as though my own steady voice were not evidence enough. But minding it and being broken by it are different things, and the difference is the whole job. A commander who is broken by it becomes bitter, and a bitter commander poisons everyone under her. A commander who minds it, but is not broken, can do something useful with the minding. She can build a place where the next person does not have to prove quite so much, quite so loudly, for quite so long. That is what I decided, standing with my hand on 42, that I would do with my command. Not nurse the wound, use it. That night I called my father. He's 79 now, and the years have made him smaller and slower, and the distance between the man who told me not to break my heart and the man on the phone has gotten shorter, the way it does when people run low on time. "You all set for your big day?" he asked. "Getting there," I said. There was a pause, the kind he takes now before the hard things. "I think about that kitchen sometimes," he said. "The summer you left, the things I said." Another pause. "You always did fly, better than me. I just never knew how to say I was scared for you instead of saying you shouldn't go." I had to sit down. 27 years I had waited near those words, and there they were, most of the way out of his mouth at last. "I know, Dad," I said. "I always knew." "You make sure they treat you right out there," he said, gruff again, hiding from the size of it. "They will," I said, "or they'll learn." I hung up and I sat in the quiet of the base lodging with the change of command program on the desk in front of me, and I thought about Mason Pruitt and about my father and about how doubt gets handed down from one generation to the next without anyone meaning any harm by it. My father did not hate women pilots. He had simply never seen one, and so he could not imagine his daughter as one. And his failure of imagination came out of his mouth as fear dressed up like advice. Pruitt did not hate women pilots either. He had a blank space where the truth should have been, and a blank space will say cruel things without ever feeling cruel. I did not want to teach that boy fear. Anybody can teach a young airman fear. I wanted to teach him to see. And by the time I turned off the light, I knew exactly how I was going to do it. The next morning, I told Reese my decision, and she looked at me like I had lost my mind. "You want him as your escort," she repeated. "Pruitt. You want the kid who laughed at you walking the line at your elbow for the whole pre-ceremony inspection. That's what I want. The whole squadron is waiting for you to drop the hammer, Frosty. They are bracing for it. Half of them think he's already finished." "I know," I said. "That's exactly why I'm not going to do it." She studied me for a long moment, and then something in her face shifted, the skepticism turning slowly into understanding, because Yolanda Reese has always been faster than she lets on. "You're not going to punish him," she said. You're going to make him stand next to it. I'm going to make him stand next to it. So that is what we did. The day before the change of command, there is an inspection of the static display aircraft, and 42 was going to be the centerpiece, parked out where the families and the brass would see it. And the crew chief, assigned to walk that inspection at my side, answering for every panel and every placard, was Senior Airman Mason Pruitt. He showed up looking like a man walking to his own sentencing. He could barely meet my eyes. And then a strange and wonderful thing happened, which is that the moment we started talking about the actual airplane, he forgot to be terrified because he was good. He was genuinely, deeply good at his job. He knew that airframe cold, every access panel, every quirk, every place where age had to be watched. He talked about 42 the way I talk about flying, with a care that you cannot fake. I let him talk. I asked him questions a lazy chief could not have answered, and he answered all of them, and I watched the wall between us slowly turn into something that was almost professional respect, in spite of the morning before. When we got to the nose of the jet, I stopped, and I looked at him, and I asked the question I had been carrying since the day before. You know this airframe cold, I said, better than most pilots ever will, so tell me something. Why did you decide I couldn't fly it? He went still. To his credit, he did not duck it. He looked down at the concrete, and then he made himself look back up at me, and what came out was honest in a way that 22-year-olds are not usually brave enough to be. I never saw anybody like you in the seat, ma'am, he said. Growing up, in the magazines, the videos, the recruiting stuff, it was always guys. I never once saw a woman in the cockpit of a fighter, so I guess I never made room for it in my head. His jaw worked. I didn't think, I just talked. And I'm sorry. Not because you're a colonel. I'd be sorry if you were a brand new lieutenant. I was wrong before I even knew your rank. I have to tell you, that landed on me harder than any apology built out of fear would have. Because it was the truest thing anybody had said to me in years, and it was the same thing my father had never quite managed to say. He never made room for it in his head. That is the whole sickness, right there, in the mouth of a kid with grease on his hands. Not hate. A blank space. A failure of imagination handed down so quietly that the people carrying it do not even know they have it. Thank you for that, I said, and I meant it. Some people will hear that and think I let him off too easy, that a real reckoning would have left him afraid. I have thought hard about this because the line between mercy and weakness is real, and a commander who cannot find it gets people hurt. But fear is a cheap tool. Fear makes people quiet, not better. A frightened airman keeps his ugly assumptions and just learns to hide them, and a hidden assumption is more dangerous than a spoken one because you cannot correct what a person will not say. What I wanted from Mason Pruitt was not silence. I wanted the assumption pulled all the way out into the daylight where both of us could look at it, and then I wanted to hand him a better one in its place. You cannot do that to a person who is busy protecting himself from you. You can only do it to a person who feels safe enough to be honest about how wrong he was. Mercy, used right, is not the absence of accountability. It is the thing that makes accountability possible. Word travels fast on a flight line. By that afternoon, the whole squadron knew that the new operations group commander had not buried Mason Pruitt. She had walked him around the Heritage jet for an hour and let him talk about his work and called him good at it. And something started to move in that squadron, something I could feel more than see. The younger airmen, the ones who had laughed by the toolboxes, were watching very closely to learn what kind of place this was going to be under the woman with the call sign. They were learning that power, real power, does not need to humiliate anyone to be felt. At the end of the inspection, I climbed the boarding ladder of 42 and lowered myself into the cockpit, just to sit there one more time, in the seat I had flown into the worst and best day of my flying life. And down on the concrete, holding the ladder steady, Mason Pruitt finally looked up at me in that cockpit and saw plainly where I belonged. I watched it happen on his face. It is a good thing to watch a young person's picture of the world get bigger. It is one of the only things that makes any of this worth it. Sitting in that cockpit, I let myself go back to the day 42 earned its name, because I wanted to remember what Pruitt had not been able to see. It was 2011. I was 30 years old. The call came in the middle of a long, boring patrol, the way the worst days always start out boring. A ground unit was in trouble, pinned in bad terrain, weather closing in over the whole valley, and the controllers were working through everyone with fuel and weapons who could get there. I had both, so I went. I am not going to dramatize it because the men and women who were actually on that ground do not need me turning their worst hour into a movie. I will tell you what mattered. The weather was below what we are supposed to fly that kind of work in. The terrain was unforgiving, and there were young soldiers down there, some of them younger than Pruitt is now, listening to my voice on the radio, and the single most important thing I could do for them, more important than anything my aircraft carried, was to sound calm. Because if I sounded calm, they would believe that someone had a handle on it. And people who believe that make better decisions than people who are drowning in their own fear. So I kept my voice level. I made pass after pass, low and slow and deliberate, in weather that kept trying to push me into the rock. And I talked to those kids the whole time in the same flat tone I would use to read a checklist, and somewhere in the middle of it, I understood why the old major had called me Frosty all those years ago. The name was never about being fearless. I was not fearless. My hands knew exactly how thin the margins were. The name was about keeping your voice level when every single thing in your body is telling you to scream. That is the only kind of courage I have ever actually had, and I have used it far more on the ground, in rooms full of people who got me wrong, than I ever used it in the air. We brought all of them home. Every soldier in that unit walked out. That is the entire reason the jet has a name and a place of honor in that hangar, and it is the reason a 22-year-old polishes it every morning without ever once imagining the person who flew it could look like me. I have never told that story to make myself sound brave, and I am not telling it that way now. Plenty of pilots would have flown that mission. Most of them, I think. The thing I am proud of is not that I went. It is the voice. It is that, for 40 minutes, with my hands full of an airplane that kept wanting to find the ground, I gave a group of terrified young people on a radio the one thing that actually changes outcomes, which is the steady, boring, unshakable sound of somebody who has it handled. They told me afterward that they could hear me smiling. I was not smiling. But I had learned, a long time before that day, how to put the calm in my voice even when it was nowhere near my chest, and that small trick has saved more than one life, including, on the bad days, my own. Frosty was never about being cold. It was about deciding on purpose to be the temperature the moment needed. Back in the present, Pruitt could not let it go, and I mean that as praise. A lesser kid would have taken the mercy and moved on, relieved. Pruitt went and looked me up. He found the citations, the 2 distinguished flying crosses, the record of the mission. He came to understand that the heritage jet he had been guarding, the one he had blocked me from approaching, was my jet, flown by me on a day he had only ever heard about as a legend with no face. And his embarrassment turned into something more useful than shame. It turned into resolve. That night I had a harder conversation with Reese than I expected. We were in her office, with the lights low and 2 cups of bad coffee, and I admitted the thing that had been nagging me. "Tell me I didn't go soft," I said. "Tell me I didn't just teach a whole squadron that you can run your mouth at a colonel and walk away with a mentorship." Reese set down her coffee and gave me the look, the one that has been setting me straight since I was a lieutenant. "Frosty," she said, "you did not go easy on that boy. You think you went easy on him. You made him carry it. You put him next to that jet and made him understand exactly what he did, in front of everyone for a whole day, and you did it without giving him the gift of being able to feel like a victim. A write-up would have let him off easy. A write-up he could have been angry about. You gave him nothing to be angry about except himself." She leaned back. "That's heavier than any paperwork I could have handed him." "You didn't go soft. You went hard in a way he'll feel for 20 years. I sat with that. She was right. She's usually right. Late that night, walking back across the dark base, I passed the hangar and saw a light still on. Mason Pruitt was in there, alone, going over 42 one more time, getting it perfect for the ceremony. Nobody had ordered him to. He did not know I could see him. He was just a young man who had decided, somewhere in the last 2 days, to become better than the morning he had laughed. I stood in the dark and watched him work, and I did not say anything. And I felt something settle in my chest that was bigger than vindication and quieter than pride. Trust is not a thing you hand someone because you feel sorry for them. It is a thing they build, brick by brick, while you watch. Over the days that followed, Mason Pruitt built. He came to me the morning after I saw him working late, and he was nervous, twisting his cap in his hands, and he asked if he could be considered for the flight line detail attached to my command section. He was careful to say it was not to make up for anything, and not to get on my good side. "I want to learn how it's supposed to be done, ma'am," he said. "From somebody who does it right, that's all." I did not just hand it to him. That would have cheapened the whole thing, for him and for everyone watching. I told him he would have to earn it the same way everyone earns everything on a flight line, by being good and being reliable, and being the person who is still there when the easy people have gone home. And then I told him that if he did that, the door was open. He nodded like I had given him something precious, which I suppose I had. A few days later, I told him a story I have not told many people. I told him about the Garmin bag in 2008, about the senior officer who handed me his laundry because he could not imagine I was the pilot, and about how I had a choice in that hallway. I could carry the resentment, or I could carry the bag and then go fly so well that the truth settled the matter for me. I chose the flying every single time, I told him. Resentment is heavy and it doesn't get you anywhere. Competence is the only argument that's ever worked for me. So be so good at your job that nobody can fit a doubt in the gap. That's the whole secret. There isn't another one. I was giving him, I realized as I said it, the exact thing my father had never been able to give me. Belief, framed as a standard to live up to. My father gave me the sky and a warning. I was trying to give this kid the sky and a challenge. It is a small difference, and it is the whole difference. I think a lot about how doubt travels. It does not usually move through hatred. Hatred is loud and obvious, and most people learn to reject it early. Doubt is quieter and far more patient. It moves through the things we never see, the absences, the empty seats, the pictures that were never taken. My father doubted me because no one in his world had ever shown him a daughter who flew fighters. So the idea sat in him as an impossibility, wearing the mask of concern. Pruitt doubted me for the same reason, one generation later, in a country that had supposedly moved on. The cure for that kind of doubt is not a lecture. You cannot argue someone out of an absence. You can only fill it. You fill it by being the thing they were told could not exist, standing right in front of them, undeniable, and then by being generous enough to let them adjust, without humiliating them for having needed to. Every time you do that, the next absence gets a little smaller. That is the slow work. That is the only work that lasts. Reese and I finalized how 42 would be presented at the ceremony, parked out front on static display, and I made a decision that I knew would be read clearly by everyone who understood the story. Mason Pruitt would be part of the crew presenting the jet, not hidden in the back, not quietly reassigned to make the optics clean, standing with the heritage aircraft, in his blues, as one of the people responsible for it. It was my way of telling the whole squadron, without a single word, that we do not throw people away here. We make them better, and then we let them stand in the light they earned. The culture of that squadron shifted in those few days, and I do not say that lightly, because culture is the hardest thing in the world to move. But the casual jokes about who belonged in a cockpit went quiet. Not because anyone was afraid of me, because the young airman had watched the whole thing play out and had quietly recalibrated what the standard was. The standard was no longer whatever got a laugh by the toolboxes. The standard was the colonel who had flown the jet they polished, and the chief whose voice could freeze a hangar, and the new way Pruitt carried himself. The day before the ceremony, I found Pruitt squaring away the display placard for 42, the little sign that tells the public what they are looking at. He was checking it against the official record, making sure every word was right, my name spelled correctly, the citation accurate, the dates exact. He did not know I was behind him. "It's right," I said, and he startled. "I checked it myself this morning. You got it right." He looked at the placard, then at me, and he said something I did not expect. "I wanted the next person who reads it to know exactly who flew it, ma'am. First time, without having to be told twice." I had asked him for an apology days before, and he had given me a better one than I knew how to ask for. "That's the apology I wanted," I told him. "Not for you to be sorry forever. For you to be the reason the next one doesn't get laughed at. That's it. That's the whole thing." The morning of the change of command came up clear and bright, the kind of flawless flying weather that feels like a gift when you need it most. They set the ceremony on the flight line itself, with the wing formed up in their blues, the families in chairs, the colors snapping in a light wind, and out front, gleaming in the morning sun, the jet we called 42, with Mason Pruitt standing at its wing in his service dress, spine straight, chin level. I want to tell you about my father, because he was there. We had gotten him out, frail as he is, 79 years old and using a cane now, and a young airman escorted him to a seat in the front row and helped him down into it with a gentleness that made my throat tight. He sat there in a jacket that was a little too big for him now, looking at a flight line full of people in uniform, looking at his daughter standing at the front of all of it. I caught his eye once before it started, and I saw the old war on his face, the fear and the pride that have always lived together in him, and I saw the pride winning, maybe for the first time in my whole life. General Hale presided. There is a moment in a change of command when the guidon, the unit's flag, is passed from hand to hand, and when it reaches you, the unit becomes yours. Every responsibility, every person, every jet, every 4 in the morning crew, yours. Hale put that guidon in my hands and said, formally, for the whole field to hear, "Colonel Whitaker, the group is yours." And then I had to speak. I had thought a long time about what to say, and in the end, I kept it short and I kept it level. The only way I know how to do anything that matters. I did not talk about myself. I talked about the people who keep jets in the air, the crews on the freezing line at 4 in the morning whose names never make it into any story, the maintainers who hand us our aircraft and trust us to bring them back. I talked about being doubted out loud, which most people in that formation had been at one time or another, and about how the only answer I had ever found that worked was to put my head down and be undeniable. And then, without naming him, I talked about a young airman who, a few days before, had reminded me exactly why this work is never finished. I said that every one of us carries a blank space somewhere, a place where we have not yet made room for someone who does not look like what we expected. And that the work of a real unit is to keep filling those spaces in, one honest moment at a time. I said I had been reminded of that this week by someone with the courage to be honest about his own blank space, and that I was grateful for it. I was not looking at Pruitt when I said it, but I felt the whole field understand, and I felt him understand most of all, standing at the wing of my jet with his eyes forward and something working in his jaw. There's a thing that happens to me at ceremonies, which is that I stop being able to see the crowd as a crowd and start seeing it as all the individual mornings that built it. I looked out at that formation, and I did not see a sea of blue uniforms. I saw the kid who would be doubted next week, and the chief who had frozen a hangar with 4 words, and the young woman 3 rows back who had probably already been handed somebody's garment bag and would be handed 100 more before her record got too long to argue with. I was not really talking to all of them. I was talking to her, the one I could not pick out, the next version of the 18-year-old in the kitchen. Everything I have ever done in uniform has secretly been addressed to her. Keep flying, I wanted to tell her. It is a long time being right before anyone admits it. Do it anyway. It lands eventually. I promise you it lands. When the formation broke and the families came forward, I went to my father. He had pushed himself up out of the chair to stand for me, leaning hard on the cane. And when I reached him, he took my hand in both of his, and his hands were shaking, and he opened his mouth to say something, and he could not. He just held my hand and looked at me, and the whole field seemed to be waiting on a sentence that 27 years had not been enough for him to find. He found it. "You always belonged up there," my father said. His voice broke on it. "I was just too scared to tell you to go. I'm sorry, Sloan. I should have told you to go. I have flown through weather that should have killed me. I have sat in a cockpit with an engine dying and kept my voice flat. And I stood on that flight line in front of my whole new command and could not keep my own voice level for the life of me. I put my arms around my father, this small, fierce, frightened man who gave me the sky and then spent a quarter of a century afraid of it. And I told him the only true thing there was to say. "You did tell me, Dad," I said. "You taught me to fly. Everything after that was just me arguing with how scared you were. I always knew the love was underneath it. I always knew." He cried a little the way old men cry, like it cost them something they cannot spare. And then he wiped his face and looked past me at the jet, at 42 shining in the sun, And he said, "That's the one you flew? In the war?" And I said, "Yes." And he looked at it for a long time. And then he looked at me, and he did not say anything else. Because he did not have to. The wall that had stood in that man for my entire life was simply gone, and behind it was only what had always been there, which was a father who loved his daughter and had never known how to be unafraid of what she was. A few weeks later, settled into the rhythm of command, I was walking the flight line one afternoon, in uniform this time, and I came around the corner of a hangar in time to see a small thing that I will keep for the rest of my life. There was a woman in civilian clothes near the line, a visiting engineer, and a brand new airman had clearly just assumed she was lost and out of place, the way Pruitt had once assumed it about me. And before I could say a word, Mason Pruitt stepped in. I heard him say, "Ma'am, are you our aircrew rep? Let me get you where you need to be." Polite, certain, making room in his head for a possibility he would not have made room for a month earlier. He did not see me. He was not performing for anyone. The lesson had simply become who he was. I stood at the corner of that hangar and watched, and I said nothing, because it did not need anything from me. It spoke for itself, which is the only kind of victory I've ever trusted. I called my father that night to tell him about it, the small scene by the hangar, Pruitt making room in his head for a stranger the way he had not made room for me. My father listened the whole way through, and when I finished there was a long quiet on the line, and then he said, in a voice gone soft with age and something else, that he was glad. Glad the boy had changed. Glad I had let him. And then he said the thing I will carry to my own end, which was that he hoped, wherever he ended up after all of this, there would be a way to watch the people I had taught keep teaching the next ones, because that, he said, was the only kind of forever that had ever made any sense to him. My father spent his life afraid of the sky and in love with it at the same time. I think at the end he finally understood that he had handed both the fear and the love to me, and that I had done something with them he had never been brave enough to do, which was to give them away again, on purpose, to someone who needed them more. That evening I sat in my new office, with the door open and the sound of jets coming home through the window. My old flight jacket hung on the hook by the door, cracked leather and a sticky zipper, the same one I had worn into that hangar pretending to be nobody. On the wall I had hung a photograph of 42. Reese stuck her head in around sunset, the way she has been sticking her head in around my life for 21 years, and she did not say anything important, and neither did I, and that easy quiet between us was worth more than every rank I have ever worn. She looked at the photograph of 42 on the wall for a second, and then she looked at the old jacket on the hook, and she shook her head and smiled and told me I had not changed since the day she signed off my first jet. I told her I hoped that was true. It is the nicest thing anyone has said to me in years, that I am still the lieutenant who flew it like she owned it. The rank changes, the jacket and the friend and the work do not. I have been thinking about what I would want you to take from all of this, if you have stayed with me this long. It is not a story about putting a young man in his place. I never wanted his place. It is not even really a story about being proven right, though I will not pretend that did not feel like something. Here is what it is. For 23 years, the truth about me had to fight its way into every room I walked into, against the blank spaces and people who had simply never seen a woman do the thing I do. My own father carried one of those blank spaces, with love, his whole life. A 22-year-old carried one into a hangar and laughed before he knew any better. And the thing I have learned, the only thing I am sure of, is that you do not fill those spaces by screaming. You fill them by being undeniable, and then by being kind to the person on the other side of the doubt, because most of them are not cruel. They are just empty in one small place, and a blank space can be filled. I never needed Mason Pruitt to be sorry. I needed the next young woman who walks onto that flight line to be believed the first time. That is the whole win. That is the only revenge I have ever wanted, and it is not really revenge at all. It is just the truth, finally landing on its own. So if you have ever been the last person anyone expected, if you have ever stood in a room and watched everyone get you wrong before you said a word, hear me. You do not have to raise your voice. You do not have to prove it to the people who cannot see it yet. Just keep flying. Be so good that the doubt has nowhere to stand. The truth always lands on its own. It just sometimes takes a tail number and a chief's voice and 23 years to do it. I stood on my flight line at dusk and watched the jets come home, one after another, lights against the darkening sky, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely, quietly at rest in the place I had earned twice. My father was proud. The boy had learned to see. The work would go on without my voice ever having to rise. I zipped my jacket against the evening cold, the same jacket, the same cold, and I went home. If you've ever walked into a room and watched everyone decide who you were, before you said a single word, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Did you correct them, or did you let the truth land on its own the way I finally learned to? And do you think I was right to give that young airman a second chance instead of dropping the hammer, or would you have handled him differently? Tell me. I read every comment. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and stay a while.